So it's the age-old question of East versus West. Which one would win if they pitted against each other? And on World of Tanks console, this is no different. As part of this new Cold War game mode that came into World of Tanks console as part of the modern tanks, obviously we are able to pick up the M1A2 Abrams and also the T72BU, where you can pit them against each other. They're the same tier, or there's the end goal tanks as part of this mode. There's going to be various different other tanks added into this game mode in the future, but for the current time we've only got 18 in total. Today's video will go through every single one of them, tell you the weak points of the tank. We're going to tell you exactly how you can take them out, what you should be using in your tank, and also how you can actually kit them out very well within this game mode. Everything should be covered as part of this, and I hope you guys do enjoy. Remember to subscribe for more content like this, and we'll get right into it now. So when you hop onto this game mode, you'll be greeted with two different tanks. Now, in order to get onto the game mode, you just go onto Cold War. You can either play co-op, which is 15 humans against 15 AI, so you will just be playing against AI when you play that, or you can play multiplayer. For this video, we're going to be playing multiplayer, not that it matters. But you can see, we'll be greeted with the M46A1 pattern, as well as the T44A. Now, you've more than likely, if you've played the World War II game mode, played these tanks before. Obviously, if you've gone down the Russian medium tank line, then you'll know the T44 very well and what it can actually do in game. It's got reliable armour. If you actually use it well, you side scrape in the tank in order to increase that effective armour. However, when you're matching up against the M46A1 pattern, the armour really doesn't do too much, and you can't really use it that effectively because, to be honest with you, the penetration on the premium rounds pretty much guarantee a pen, and the standard rounds might maybe bounce a couple every now and again. But as far as the two tanks at the beginning, which one is better? In my personal opinion, I believe if you're going to pick one of them, it's going to be the T44A. Now, this is the Soviet or the Eastern Alliance, is what they've kind of separated the two tech trees into, and then obviously there's the premium tech tree as well. So that's kind of a different one. There's two premiums that come in at the top tier of the post-war era, which is this denoted by the one at the top right corner of the tech tree tank, where you can see. So you see when it says one, that's post-war, then it goes on to detente, and then there's extra ones after that. Now, in terms of the first one, we'll look at the M46 first. So the M46 is a very, very similar to the other M48 patterns and stuff like that you've already seen. It's got that reliable gun that can actually be used fairly well. However, on this mode, I did choose to go with accuracy because for some reason it doesn't feel too good. So when kitting out your tank, the ones that I chose to go with for the M46A1 was to get that view range up. I want to spot enemy tanks. I want to get that assistance damage to help me out with marks of excellence and the various other things and aspects of World of Tanks that keep the game entertaining. I thought that, adding in the view range will also help me get that advantage over other players that may not have actually chosen to have that. Then I went with stabilizer. Now, when you can get stabilizer on your tank, it's 100% important to be able to put it on your tank. You're going to do so much better. So if you put that on your tank, it's a must-have. For me personally, if I'm going to play any tank in the game, I will put gun stabilizer on it, unless it's got superior accuracy to begin with. Then I went with aiming speed because for some reason the aiming speed of these tanks feels very, very slow. I don't know if that's just because they reload so quick that you don't actually fully aim in enough, but that's why I went with it. Obviously there's options to go with loading time or ventilation. Both would be good options. Obviously you could go for a camo build where you reduce the tank detectability with advanced concealment. That's a cheap option, and maybe as the first upgrades, if you haven't got enough silver, I would definitely put on advanced concealment and advanced optics to reduce that chance of actually getting lit up in the game mode, because if that happens, you get focused pretty hard, and that's one thing that I've noticed throughout playing. Now, in terms of what the actual performance of the tank is like, what's the armour like? Well, you'll see on the armour model here, that the turret armour is actually fairly decent unless you manage to hit this cheek area, which is either side of this big green mantlet. That consists of basically spaced armour, and you don't want to hit anywhere near that. Or you could alternatively go for the cupola of the tank, which is that kind of bulbous bit on the top left of the turret. That's going to be where you want to be aiming if you're going to actually take this tank out. And if you're in the T44 or the same tank at the same tier, you want to be shooting at that. Now, obviously, the best place to shoot it is actually in the upper plate or the lower plate. Lower plate is going to consistently allow you to actually pen the tank, especially if you're in a T44, because you're lower profile than the M46A1 pattern, and therefore you can actually shoot it at a better angle, which is going to grant you more penetration chance, whereas the upper plate might slightly bounce depending on the angle of it. However, always shoot the hull of this tank if you can actually hit it, because that's more likely to go through. Obviously, if you get the side of it, it's pretty much a guaranteed pen, and the same with the turret. So if you can get the side of the turret and the side of the hull of the tank, then you're pretty much good to go, and you'll do really, really well. So as for the gun on this tank, it's much better than in terms of accuracy and stuff like that than the other, than the T44A. But it does get some slight drawbacks in terms of the alpha damage that you can put out comparatively to the T44A. Now, that's kind of the trade-off between the two tanks. So now we'll go over to the T44A. This is my favourite at this tier, just because that gun that you get at the beginning, you don't have to really upgrade. The accuracy is fairly decent, but it's not amazing. And what you can do is the heat rounds on it actually get 330 penetration, which is more than enough to be able to go through the front of the M46 and also the higher tier tanks that you meet. If you do fire that premium round, you do get an additional amount of damage, plus 70 damage. That's a total of nearly 30% extra damage per shot if you pick the heat rounds in this thing. Now, the heat rounds, however, do come at a massive cost, so you'll be destroying your bank account, basically. But for me personally, I've played the game a lot. I have enough premium tanks to earn that money back. So being able to spend that much in a game is not that big of a problem for me. But if you're a standard player with no premium account, or you haven't got premium tanks in your garage, then you want to be taking a lot less premium rounds in this thing, and you might have to fire standard. Another big thing is the module cost. Obviously, to upgrade your gun in the first place, you will take a slight hit to your rate of fire and therefore your DPM, which is something that isn't really worth it considering you're paying 600,000 silver, which for some reason Wargaming have decided is an okay price for an upgrade in just a tank that you will probably progress to the next one very, very quickly. It should only take you about 100 games to be able to get the next one if you've got a premium account. Yeah, not something I'm going to be doing. I definitely won't be purchasing the gun, but if you are going to get any of the guns, I would recommend the final one. Now, in terms of the armour of this tank, the weakest point is the turret, to be honest. The turret armour on these cheek bits that you can see from the front, either side of the mantlet, are terrible. And I mean terrible. You can pen this thing with the M46 very, very reliably, and if you can only see the top of it, you can actually pen the roof of this tank, because it has so little armour on the top that you can overmatch it very, very reliably. And if you're above it, just shoot down either on the hull of the tank, which is this upper plate bit here that you can see, or you can just shoot the roof, because the roof is absolute paper and you can overmatch, which means that you don't even have to come in at a good angle. It could just go straight through. So there you go, the two of the tanks in the beginning. Definitely go with the T44A if you're wanting the most competitive at this tier within this post-war game mode, basically. But in terms of the progression, it's kind of up for your interpretation, and we will go through the various different tank lines. We're not going to go through every single tank in super detail, but we will give the highlights of the tank. Now, when you go up the tier, on the M46 line, you actually get the M47. Now, the M47 is a really good tank to begin with. It comes with a much nicer gun than the M46. It's not a massive upgrade over the previous tank because the armor model isn't particularly amazing. Your turret kind of lacks a little bit, but it becomes a little bit more bouncy, so it's not as easy to pen those cheeks of this one because they've got a lot better angles in there overall. Your cupola's a lot bigger, so people can actually snipe that quite easily. It's somewhere where this tank kind of suffers. But the upper plate and the lower plate kind of become a little bit better comparatively. But you certainly won't be, bouncing too many shots, and side scraping and stuff like that will help. But it's not going to enable you to, be superior. This game mode is all about becoming sneaky, making sure you get yourselves in a position where you're not going to be getting hit that often. Because when you do, it tends to pen unless it's super long range. Now, in terms of the upgrades, obviously you want to get the upgrades if you really want to. You can get a 105, which is going to boost your DPM up slightly, not by a lot, but it will get you that extra alpha damage. You do suffer a big hit to your DPM if you go for that, but it's definitely worth it just to have that alpha over the previous tanks and the tiers below that you can actually meet. Obviously then it leads on to the M48A5 pattern, which we'll have a look at next. So we'll go right the way through the American tech tree now, and then go through the Eastern Alliance tech tree. So the top tier, or the top daddy of this post-war era, is the M48A5 PI pattern. So this is kind of very similar to the M48 pattern that you'll see in the current game of World War II mode. Obviously this is in the modern tanks / Cold War era mode. You'll see that the armour of this is far better. It's so much better than the previous tanks. You'll see that the hull armour is way better. It's really well angled comparatively. The lower tier tanks are going to really struggle to be able to actually pen you reliably in this thing. A lot more so anyway. Obviously if they're firing a lot of premium rounds, they will be able to go through you because your lower plate isn't super strong and your upper plate isn't super strong. The main area of weakness for this tank though is that cupola on the top left of the turret from when you're looking at it straight. You see that the cupola, that can be a real problem for this tank. So if you can hide it at all, or if you can wobble or wiggle doing this, putting your gun in the way, so actually putting your gun up in the air after you've taken a shot at someone, then put your gun in the air, wobble, try and basically bait their shot into your barrel of your tank, which is going to mean that they can't actually hit your cupola, and that's something experienced players will take advantage of. So making sure that they're doing this to avoid actually being able to hit your cupola. Other than that, that's pretty much the armour model. Now, looking at the actual turret, you can actually get a better turret. What's better about it? Well, you get better view range and you actually get more hit points, and I expect that you'll actually get more armour on the turret maybe. I haven't been confirmed, but I would expect so. Now, obviously, you get much better penetration. You can see the difference in values here, and you also get that 390 alpha damage boost over the previous tank with only a 105 that I think does 320 alpha, if I'm right in thinking so. So you'll get that really better gun, and you'll be able to deal a lot more DPM with the M48A5 pattern. So be sure to have a look at that and kind of make your mind up as to which era you actually like. In terms of the one that you want to stay at, because obviously if you go up to the next one you'll be kind of bottom tier again in terms of the matchmaking, because obviously they are matchmaked in sets of 3, so the M46 to the M48 will all be matched together, and then the M60 to the M60A3 will be matched together, and then the M1 to the M1A2 will also be matched together. Similarly, on the Eastern Tech Tree, you will also meet up to the Object 165. Now, looking at the second of the T54, you can actually see that this tank is somewhat better. This armour is far better than the M47's armour. You can actually bounce quite well, and if you wiggle and use your actual armour, you can certainly pull off a lot more bounces. Your gun's actually really good, and I'd say for the post-war era, like the first era that you can actually play in the Cold War game mode, this tank is definitely going to have the best options for you. You've certainly got room to have some really good games. And if you look at the actual armaments that this can actually put on, you've got 100mm gun that has 7.32 rate of fire. So although it doesn't have the highest alpha, you can certainly have some really good games, and it's up to you whether you actually pick the next package in this tank or whether you just stick with the standard one. Obviously you'll be getting that extra bit of accuracy, and you get the extra rate of fire, but your penetration does suffer, and that's one thing that you need to note. However, if you do fire premium rounds, you'll be able to basically kind of minimize the amount of effect that will actually have on your performance in game. One thing that I would like to note, however, is the view range of these isn't as good as the American line in the game. They tend to have a little bit better view range, so you're not going to be spotting as well, but you do have the armor buff over those tanks, so it's really a bit of a trade-off. And personally, I think that the Eastern Alliance is the better one out of the two in this first era. Obviously, you guys can have your own opinion, but I am going to make some justifications in a second. Now, in terms of the Object 165, you get 320 alpha damage as part of the first package that you get. View range of 415 meters is pretty poor, and you're not going to really be able to do too much, but this plays a little bit more like a heavy tank in this kind of era where you actually get much better armor than anyone else. Turret is actually useful, but the cupola can be penned fairly easily if you actually manage to aim it there well. Up close and personal, obviously from long distances you ain't going to be able to do too much to it. 50 km/h speed is pretty good, and that will get you around the maps fairly quickly. Guns are actually really decent on this. Obviously it's up to you whether you want to actually put the next gun on. It will probably cost you about 5 million silver or something just to actually upgrade the gun, but it's up to you, and I think it will actually realistically be about 2 million silver to upgrade this gun, but I'm not entirely sure. Now, in terms of moving on to the next era, we will start with the Western Alliance to move on to the M60, and then we'll go on to the Eastern again. Right, so the M60 here, we have some really decent statistics over the previous tank. However, they don't match up against each other, so we can't really compare them too much. In terms of the armor, you've got this massive bulbous thing on the top of your tank, which is really weak, and you'll be able to get penned very reliably. You're not really going to have much armor. This thing is going to have to be used like a kind of mobile sort of medium tank that gets around the battlefield, and you try and stay hidden, poke out against opponents that you know have already fired, and then get back around that cover, because if you don't, you're going to have some real big problems that you probably don't want to have. In terms of the guns, I would recommend upgrading if you can, or if you can afford it, because you get that much better penetration, you get more alpha damage by 70. You're going to have a much better time of it if you actually do upgrade. Certainly something that I would do on the M60, and you're going to have to play it for a little bit, about 160,000 XP. I don't know how much of that you will need to be able to get this before you actually get the next tank, but hopefully it's not too much and you'll be able to actually use it for a little bit of time. Obviously, if you're going for 3 marks, this is the optimum setup for the tank. Other than that, that's kind of how you have to play it. You've got to be a bit of an opportunistic tank in this thing, and you certainly don't want to be just sat out there getting hit by everything because you don't have the armor for that. As far as the next tank goes, we've got the M60A1. This is a upgrade on the M60. Obviously, as you go up a tier, it should be an upgrade. You get more vision, which is going to be really useful. Your still concealment goes down as well. Your speed remains the same. You get a little bit more hit points, and you get a little bit more penetration on your standard gun that you actually have. Now, if you then decide to go for the next gun that you can get, you will get that 460 alpha damage. You also get the increase to penetration, which you do with the previous tank, so I would recommend, once again, if you can, to be able to pick up that gun on this tank. Armor wise, you get a little bit more armor, but nothing too fantastic. You certainly want to be aiming at that cupola at the top or the lower plate of this tank if you can manage to get it. Obviously, the cupola of this tank is probably the weakest point, and the lower plate of this is actually probably not actually as bad. So make sure that if you are coming up against this, you want to be shooting that cupola if it's out there, or if they're wiggling a lot and moving about, you'll probably be able to pen the lower plate of this thing fairly reliably. So aim at those 2 points if you're coming up against it, and that is pretty much what that tank goes like. Moving on to the M60A3, the next one, or the top daddy in this tech tree, or the era, then this one is a lot better. The cupola gets even stronger, so it's going to be a little bit harder for those tanks that come up against it to be able to pen it. You know, the M60s are going to find it a little bit more of a struggle to be able to go through it reliably, but it still is quite big, and it's definitely not very strong, and you can certainly more than likely go through it with those M60, and that's the lowest tier, let alone if you go up the tiers. Cheeks of the tank get a little bit better, however they can probably still be penned by those heat rounds or the premium rounds of most tanks at the tier. Lower plate is massive and one of the big weak points of the American tanks, so beware of that. If you're coming up against them, you can probably pen them through that lower plate very reliably indeed. In terms of the upgrades that you can get in this tank, you don't actually get or you do get a weapon upgrade, but it's after you receive the M1 Abrams. So if you're planning on 3 marking the tank, you may want to carry on. You might want to grind out that extra bit of XP to be able to get the 105 gun at the top, which gives you an extra 20 damage, so you'll have 480 damage. You get more accuracy, more penetration, slightly worse rate of fire, but that will also lead to a increase in DPM, so you're not really trading much off there, and certainly you want to get the next gun if you can afford it before you get the M1 Abrams. In comparison to the Eastern Alliance, now the first tank that you do get is the T62. This thing has actual armour that works. You know, there's a lot less of a weak spot. However, you can get penned through the upper plate really reliably, but if you're moving and you're side scraping, you're putting your track in the way of people being able to hit you. If they're firing heat rounds, they'll be able to just track you. If you're moving your turret about, it's harder to hit the cupolas. So in general terms, they do have slightly better armor than the American, or what I should say, the Western Alliance does. But this certainly has some really decent armor in comparison. In terms of the gun, it also gets a way better gun at the beginning. You get 500 alpha, however it does get pretty weak accuracy, so you've only got 0.39 accuracy to begin with, which is far worse than the patterns do, or the M60s. Aim time of 2.3 seconds isn't amazing, but certainly the line that I'd probably want to go down if I'm going to be playing. I'm certainly more favouring the Eastern Alliance out of all of the tanks I've seen so far. They're more novel, they're kind of newer design, and also, you know, you get the idea of being able to play that T72BU at the end of it. Armour, once again, decent, and we'll move on to the next tank. Obviously, if you can upgrade the gun, then you probably want to for that extra damage and also the rate of fire increase that you do get, and also the penetration increase as well. Then we've got the T72A. Obviously, this is somewhat a little bit like that premium tank that they gave away as part of the Tier 9. It's kind of got that lower plate, this kind of big tracks that have lots of spaced armour on the side of it. Makes it a lot harder to actually pen. This thing, once again, has so much more armour than the M60s. Going to find it a real struggle to actually go through them. The lower plate has some spaced armour on it, which makes it even harder. Turret is a lot stronger, however it does have that cupola which you can hit, and that's the weak spot of the turret. Obviously the weak spot of the actual tank is actually that lower plate, but it's the upper bit of the lower plate that you want to be aiming at. As far as packages go, you'll probably want to upgrade just the engine, because that's going to be the cheapest, or one of the more cheaper options. You might want to increase the signal range, and then you'll probably want to go for the turret and the gun. If you're going to fully upgrade this tank to try and mark it, or whatever you're planning on doing, then that's what I do. Obviously, the gun of the tank gets far better accuracy. You get 0.02 more accuracy. You get better rate of fire. You got more penetration. And yeah, I would 100% recommend upgrading the turret, the gun, and also the signal and engine. So, you don't necessarily need the whole rotation speed, and you don't necessarily need the first signal range either. So it's up to you what you go with, but that's what I would recommend. Then moving on to the very top daddy of the tier, the T72AV. Now this is obviously a very, very novel tank. You don't really see anything like this before. It's got this very, very weird spaced armour layout, reactive armour. It looks very, very interesting. Certainly got a lot more armour than any tank that you've probably seen before. This looks really, really nice, and certainly trying to pen it in the side, if it's side scraping, is going to be super difficult. You won't be able to do it very reliably. You can still hit the lower plate, but you're going to struggle if you're firing heat rounds at it. So you might want to be firing AP, CR or AP rounds at the lower plate, because it is covered in space if you're actually able to go through it. Obviously you want to test that out yourself when you manage to get up to these tiers. And so it's really important to have high standard penetration as opposed to just having heat high penetration as well. In terms of the turret weak points, you've obviously, like the previous tanks, got that cupola weak spot at the very top that you want to hit, or you can hit alternatively just to the left of the turret or the mantlet of this tank, which is slightly weak. It's actually only like 120mm thick, so if you can actually hit that reliably, then that's the area that you want to be looking at when you actually take out this tank. Obviously that's harder than you think, and so trying to hit that is going to be difficult. You see where that little light is? That's where you want to be aiming if you're going to shoot at this tank in the game. Obviously the side armour is going to be really, really strong. It's got spaced armour, then it's got spaced armour like pads on it as well, so you have multiple layers of spaced. Then you've got the tracks, then you've got the side armour, so it's really, really difficult to be able to go through it. I'd recommend, if you actually get the side of this tank, to be able to shoot that rear track on either side. So you see where that track wheel is, you can pen it and deal damage through that area there, because it has a lot weak, or a lot of more of a weakly armoured point of the tank. So that's where you want to be aiming. If you've got the full side of it, aim at that rear point on the tank where the spaced armour doesn't really cover it. And you will only be able to go through the tracks and then the back of the tank as well. So you'll be able to pen this tank and actually track it at the same time. And that's where you want to be going if you're coming up against this tank in any of your M60s or any of the lower tier Russian ones in the game. So make sure you do that if you actually decide to play this tank. Similarly, you probably want to go with the radio range if you can, because you get that extra 60 meters of signal range. Then I'd go for the view range upgrade of 470 and the hit points and turret rotation speed, because that's more important than just getting a flat 2 degrees a second, because they work both combined. Then obviously you get the actual tank, the T72B, which is the next era. And then you can also get an upgrade to the gun, but that's after you unlock the next tank. So it's up to you whether you pick to actually keep playing in this tier or whether you move on to something else. The 125mm has better accuracy and it also has a higher rate of fire, so you have more DPM. So if you want to keep playing, in my personal opinion, between the two, it's going to be far better to play this tank than the M60 is. Or the M60A3 at the same tier. So it's up to you which one you want to play. It's kind of a bit, well, it's just really up to what kind of playstyle you like. Do you want a little bit more armour that kind of gives you the option to brawl, or do you want to be more of a medium tank, sole medium tank anyway, by playing the Eastern or the Western Alliance tanks like the American ones that we've currently got? Then the final era of tanks that we do have in the game is the M1 Abrams on the Western Alliance. You'll be able to pick this up if you've managed to ground through all of the previous tanks, and then you'll have this one to play. Obviously the line continues up to the M1A2 Abrams, so you can definitely progress through there depending on whether you want to continue playing or not. but it is certainly going to get costly for you. Obviously the upgrades scale with the level of tank that you're playing in, and so each upgrade is going to cost you more, starting off with the starting tanks having like 1.1 million for a gun, whereas this will probably be like a couple million to be able to pick up that gun on this tank. Now, what is special about the M1 Abrams? Well, to be honest with you, you can get penned or overmatched in a lot of places on the M1 Abrams that you might not have thought was possible. Now, what you might not actually know is you can actually get hit in the upper plate and penned fairly reliably if they actually manage to hit you there. I've also got this cupola on the top of your tank, which is kind of a little bit of a weak point, and also the cheeks of the Abrams can actually be penned as well if they've got high enough pen. However, they are well angled, and it kind of relies on you actually being at this kind of angle against the tank, at which point you might actually want to aim for the hull of the tank, aiming at that front drive wheel to track and deal damage to the tank. Obviously, you can get round behind it. It's got very little armour on the back of it, and so that's kind of the area that you want to be able to come up against this tank in. However, you should note that the gun of this tank is actually fairly decent. It's got 480 alpha damage, and when you get fully upgraded, you might even get a little more. However, it doesn't appear to be that way. If you upgrade the gun on this thing, you'll get more rate of fire, you get a really good accuracy as well. You'll get the same damage, however you will get increased penetration. So that's something to note, and the increase in penetration is probably more needed on this tank for those Russian ones that you come up against that have a lot more effective armour than this tank does. So be aware that the M1 Abrams probably isn't as effective in terms of its armour as the Eastern Alliance ones that we currently have in the game. Then moving on to the M1A1 Abrams, you should note that this is very, very similar to the previous tanks. You've got that big lower plate, which actually can get penned fairly easily. You've also got the cupolas that can be hit, and also those cheeks of the tank if they've got high enough penetration to be able to go through them. However, they are quite strong. So if you've got that like 500 pen, then you'd probably be able to go through it if it's angling like this, but if it's frontal on, then you might not be able to as easily. So yeah, it's really a case of if you can get hold down in this thing, you might have a better chance at being able to bounce, but you are huge and you've got this massive bit of side armour that really doesn't have much of armour, if I'm going to be seriously honest with you. So if you come up against this tank, obviously try and get round behind it like the other previous one, or alternatively you can try and track and pen it at the same time through those big drive wheels and the side of the hull as well. So those are the areas which you want to focus on. If you're going to upgrade this thing, I'd recommend getting the bit better engine to get up to that high top speeds that this thing has. 67 kilometers an hour is massive and can be really, really useful. You'll probably want to get that signal range as well, and then you'll probably want to upgrade the gun as well, because you'll get more DPM and you'll also get better accuracy with nothing else changing. Then the turret, if you want to get it, you'll get better view range, but you'll also sacrifice some turret rotation speed, so how fast you can actually turn your turret, but you'll get some extra hit points as well. So up to you what you want to do, but essentially it's down to you as to whether you want to actually pick up this tank or upgrade it, or just play it stock like the previous ones. Now, when you get up to the M1 Abrams, or M1A2 Abrams, which is the top daddy of this tier, this is the one that everyone wants. Its armour gets so much better. Turret armour is actually a strong point, so you can't pen it through those cheeks anymore. The cupola becomes the weakest point on the turret, so you might want to be able to shoot that if you can manage to hit it. Obviously there's a few cupolas, so you want to avoid hitting the spaced armour ones, but certainly aiming at that cupola can be the real weak point of this tank. Lower plate is actually a weak point as well. However, you might be able to overmatch the top of the upper plate as well, so that's another area that you'll be able to see, but you'll have to test that out yourself because I haven't actually done it myself. Now, side of the tank is pretty weak, however it does have that spaced armour, and then you'll have to go through a decent amount of side armour as well. So the side armour is not as weak as it was, so that's key for you to actually understand on this one. The back of the tank is obviously the weakest point, so if you see the back of the side of the tank, then you want to be aiming at that place here. You can see that it's very, very weak. It does have some spaced armour on it, but essentially you want to aim at that track, the back track here that you can see. If you hit that, you'll be able to go through and pen the actual tank at the same time. Also keep it from using that mobility, and that's the real kind of key for this when you come up against it, is to track it down, get it locked down. Can't do very much from there, and then you can use your alpha damage that you get on the Eastern Alliance to be able to shut it down. In terms of upgrades, then you'll probably want to go with the horsepower, and you'll probably want to go with the gun. You'll want the signal range as well, because that's a massive upgrade from the 590. You probably won't want to get the first signal range, and you might want to get the whole traverse speed as well, so it's up to you which ones you prioritise. For me personally, I'd probably prioritise the radio module, the second one. I wouldn't get the first one. Then I'd get the engine, and then I'd get the gun, and then I'd probably get the suspension module. So it's up to you which order you do it in, but that's the way I do it. Interested to see what you think of the M1A2 Abrams, whether you'd want that one or whether you want the Russian T-72BU. Right, moving on to the Eastern era, last era tanks in the game, then you want to be looking at the T-72B. Now, yes, it follows the trend of the previous tanks, whereby they just have the better armour out of the two. You've also got the bigger alpha out of the two, and you've got that kind of lower max speed, so you won't be able to go as fast, but obviously that's why you get the better armour out of the two tanks. In terms of the upgrades of this tank, you'll be able to get the horsepower. That's the one that I would focus on the most. You definitely want that as fast as possible. You get that extra 300 horsepower, which is going to mean a lot, and I mean a lot when you play it. You probably want to get the signal range just to begin with, because it will be cheap anyway, and then you might want to get the next signal range when you can afford it. Then you'll probably want to be able to get the suspension turret. I would kind of... I'd get that if you can afford it, but if you're close to getting the next gun, then I'd recommend getting that instead, because, you know, the gun is the most important thing on the tank, and it's going to give you that massive penetration boost, which is something you'll need at this tier if you're going to come up against the same tank at the tier. Now, obviously that's kind of how the upgrades will work, but the armour works very, very well on this tank. Now, you've got this loads and loads and loads of spaced armour that just sits on top of each other. They've got these padded like kind of areas of 15mm of spaced armour, which kind of helps with the avoiding taking damage. The lower plate, obviously, like the previous one, you want to aim at the upper bit of the lower plate. So if you can hit that area there in front of this kind of castle-y looking spaced armour, then that's the bit that you want to be doing to enable you to actually pen this. Alternatively, you want to aim for the bits which you can't actually see these like padded bits on. So if you can hit in between them, you'll actually be able to pen them fairly reliably. Especially if you're above them, you can definitely pen this kind of upper plate bit if you hit in between. So when you're aiming at them, make sure you try and hit in the area where you can see that there aren't any of those blocks of spaced armour, because that will just make it a lot harder to actually pen. Cupola of this tank is a lot harder to hit, so if you're trying to hit that, then it certainly isn't going to be as easy for you. And yeah, I'd definitely try and avoid hitting the cupola if possible. You might want to hit just to the left of the cheek of this tank, because you see there's an area without any of the bobbles on. That will probably be the same area that has the light, so if you can hit where the light is just to the left of the gun on this tank, you can actually pen it if you've got high penetration rounds. However, you will need a lot, and you want to hit it as flat as possible in whatever angle you're coming at. So it's kind of an area which will be a little bit dodgy if you're in the same tier tank, and certainly you want the premium rounds to be able to do that. Now, in terms of the upgrades, like we've said, you want to go for the gun, you want to make sure you maximise everything, get that penetration increase, and then go for the turret after. But we'll move on to the next tank in this era, which is the T-72B OBR 1989. This tank is basically another upgrade on the T-72B. It's fantastic. It's really, really fantastic. The armour model of this tank is far better. You've got a lot thicker spaced armour. So the spaced armour on this one is thicker, but it also is kind of at a better angle. It covers more of the tank, and so you're going to find it really hard to hit certain areas. The cupola is more prominent on the T72B OBR, so you can actually hit that a lot easier than the previous one. The turret of this tank has those cheeks as well, just to the left and to the right of the gun. However, you want to hit the left of the gun because there's a bigger area for you to hit, and it's also flatter, so you want to hit that area if possible. But make sure you test that out first. Lower plate, like before, it's got even slimmer of an area that you can actually hit it with that where you can actually pen it anyway, or at least pen it reliably. And then the upper plate, you want to hit around the edges of it. If you can see here where that kind of rivets are that are on the front of it, where they've got slapped on extra armour, you want to hit to the side of those and to the edges to ensure that you're not hitting that spaced upper bit of the tank, which is just extra armour. The side armour of this thing is going to be really strong, so side scraping in it is kind of the key to success. As with all of these Russian ones, side scraping is going to be key, and brawling, getting as close as possible, because the accuracy of them isn't the best, and so if you can get up close and personal, whether you don't need as good accuracy, that's kind of going to be the winning point of these tanks. Obviously, you've got a little bit less mobility than the M1 Abrams and that line, but you certainly have enough to be able to get around the battlefield if you want to. And obviously you can put on some equipment to kind of better suit your tank if you really want to be that much faster by putting on the new equipment that they've got in the game. Then the final tank in this kind of review or preview of all of these tanks is the T72BU. You can see the armor profile is very funky. This is going to make it a lot harder for you to be able to actually pen weak points, since there aren't very many of them. I'm not going to lie, the cupola is the weakest point of the tank, kind of easily from the front anyway. You can hit that. If you can actually get a shot on it, you want to make sure you're aiming for that cupola. And also, the turret might actually be weak if you can manage to get those really high penetration rounds and actually shoot in the flat part of the turret. Since it's quite well rounded, it's going to be very hard for you to do that. And you'll need to be brawling with this thing if you're going to be able to actually reliably do that yourself. Making sure you're trying to avoid that spaced armor, because that makes it so much harder to hit. Now, side armour, as with the previous ones, you want to be aiming at this rear drive wheel where you can pen and track it. So that's a key to success against the Russian ones. If you can get that rear drive wheel, you can track it down, you can lock it down, you can pen it really easily because there's no spaced armour around it other than the tracks, and you'll have a much better day when you're fighting this thing. Obviously, getting around any of the tanks will be the best option if you can, and certainly the thing that you want to be doing if you can do that in this game. In terms of upgrades, the ones you want to prioritise most are getting the whole traverse speed by getting the first suspension module, which will increase your whole rotation speed by 4 degrees a second, which is kind of influential. And then you probably want to get the second signal range, because the first one really doesn't boost it too much. Then you want to get the horsepower or the engine buff, because that increases massive to your tank, and it's going to mean you can go a lot faster than what it actually is in the beginning. Horsepower is key to be able to get up to your top speed faster. And then you want to go for the gun. Obviously, get that accuracy down as fast as possible, so that when you're fighting the opposite number, you can actually be more reliable in order to actually hit the enemy tanks that you're coming up against. Obviously, the DPM buff that you get as well is going to be key. And when you reach this tier, you'll probably just want to upgrade all of the modules that you possibly can when you get there. So make sure that you do that. Obviously, put on as much equipment as you can in this tank as well, because that will maximise it even further. Other than that, guys, that is literally the whole review of both tech trees from the east and west. Hopefully, you kind of have got the idea of which tanks are the better ones, which ones suit your playstyle. Both can be really good in terms of the M1A2 Abrams, which gets that much better accuracy, and the gun is actually slightly lower alpha, but you get that kind of mobility with the tank. Accuracy at the end of the day ends up being fairly similar, but throughout the whole line you tend to have better accuracy throughout the whole thing with the American ones up to the top tier tank, at which point they basically become the same. You get a little bit more health with the M1A2 Abrams, and you get better concealment as well, better view range, if I'm right in thinking so. So it's really up to you as to which one you go for. But personally, I think in terms of the way I like playing, I'm going to get the T72BU first, and then I will get the Abrams after. Hopefully you did enjoy the video. If you did, please hit that like button and subscribe for more, because this took quite a long time to make. I hope it was kind of clear, and we went through all of the tanks individually. We managed to actually show off what's good about them, what packages you should obviously pick first. We'll do that for future tech trees, and obviously if you're subscribed, you'll keep up to date with the content I release. So if they come out in the Cold War, I will do the same for them too. If you want any particular content, then make sure to comment down below and tell me why you want that content and why it will be beneficial. And tell me what your thoughts are on these two tanks, which one's better, East or West, and I hope to see you in the next video. Goodbye.